Welcome to Badger Talks Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond, demonstrating the power of the Wisconsin idea, one connection at a time.
So hi, I'm Shawn Green. I'm a professor and the department chair in the Department of Psychology. Welcome to my Badger Talk on video games and the brain. So video games are obviously a kind of worldwide phenomena. So estimates put the number of active video gamers at, say, 3.5 billion people. It's 40% of the world's population plays video games in some guise, whether on mobile, or handheld devices, on consoles, on computers. And so any time a form of technology becomes this popular, people start to have questions about how that form of technology might impact the human brain, body, behavior. So we've seen this in everything from the steam engine through the television. And so often, say when I come out in the Wisconsin community and parents ask me questions, they'll ask me questions like, should I let my child play video games? Or what is video game playing doing to my child's brain? And this way of thinking about the impact of video games really comes strongly from the way it's conceptualized in the popular media, where you might see headlines that look like these. So video games are bad for you, video games are good for you, video games are good at work, video games are bad for children. And the problem with thinking about video games in this way is that video games aren't one thing. Video games is a really high-level label that we give to lots of different, very different experiences. And for us in psychology, really the way that we think about the impact of experience on the brain is that the experiences are what matter, not the label. And so if we think about the word video games, it can equally apply to this game, Flappy Bird, where you press exactly one button and your bird goes up and down to avoid the pipes. Or this game, Horizon Zero Dawn, where you explore a rich world, there's a complex narrative, lots of new things to experience, new mechanics to learn. And so for our perspective, there's really no reason to think that, Candy Crush on the left would have the same impact as Red Dead Redemption on the right, just because they both get the label of video games. What matters to us is what's in the games. And so one way to kind of think about this is if we replace the word video games in these headlines with another kind of concept that's kind of similarly high level. Let's say we replace it with foods. Foods are a similar high-level category label. Well, if you read the headline, foods are bad for you, or foods are good for you, especially at work, you would recognize that that doesn't make a lot of sense, because what matters for food is, well, what's in the food? What is the vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, proteins, fats? How much of it do you eat? Over what time span are you eating it? And this is true of video games as well. It's exactly the way that we have to think about how video games impact us is, what game is it? What things happen in those games? How much am I playing? Over what period of time am I playing? And so what matters is the type of games played. And so I'm going to give two quick examples of how this plays out in our science. The first is looking at some positive effects that certain games have on perceptual and cognitive skills. And so here we differentiate between two types of video games. One type we call action video games. And this is a type of video game that has really strong demands on your visual system. So you have to constantly kind of detect things in the far periphery. You have to keep track of multiple fast-moving items at once. And also on your cognitive and motor systems. So you have to make fast decisions. Those decisions have to be accurate. And then you have to make fine motor actions to kind of take those decisions out into the world. And so often these games are what we would call first and third person shooter games. We don't think it's important that you're shooting necessarily, but those are some ways that you can put really extreme demands on these perceptual and cognitive systems. Other games, meanwhile, don't have those same demands. So for instance, life simulation games. And so when we do science in this field, often we'll contrast people who play lots and lots of action video games against those who play the same amount of video games, but they're playing, say, the life simulation games. Our expectation is that, well, the action video games put really strong demands on perceptual and cognitive systems. They should improve those systems, whereas we should see lesser improvement from the life simulation games, or no improvement. And this is what we see. So this graph basically captures hundreds and hundreds of unique studies that have examined whether people who play action video games have better perceptual and cognitive capacities than those who play other types of games, non-action video games. So anything above the 0 line means that action gamers are better. You can see that everything is above the 0 line. So people who play action video games have been found to have better base perceptual skills, in particular visual skills, better spatial cognition. So this would be the ability to, say, imagine the way things fit together in space. Better multitasking abilities, so the ability to kind of do two things kind of simultaneously. And so these effects are big enough that lots of people have started to think about how we might be able to use them out in the real world. So in kind of practical settings. So for instance, retraining people with amblyopia, which is colloquially known as lazy eye. So can we use these types of games to improve vision in people with lazy eye? Can we train them, or can we use these games to train people who have jobs that require really strong perceptual or cognitive motor demands? So things like endoscopic surgery that shares lots of features with certain types of games, or piloting, whether it's flying kind of unmanned aerial vehicles or actual airplanes. There's even research suggesting that playing these action games can improve reading in children with dyslexia, in particular children whose form of dyslexia includes problems with visual attention. Kind of picking out the letters appropriately. And so this is, for us, a really good example where the type of game matters. Playing these action games has these benefits, but it's not something that we see necessarily from all video games. I'm going to give another example, which is in kind of a more negative space, which is video game addiction. So lots of people are concerned that video games could be addicting. Sometimes we call this problem gaming. One thing that makes this hard for us as scientists is that problem gaming isn't a formal mental disorder in the United States. So the American Psychiatric Association doesn't yet label this to be a formal mental health disorder. It's labeled as a formal mental health disorder in other parts of the world, though. And so really what behavioral addiction is when you repeatedly engage in some type of activity, really despite the fact that that activity is causing some real-world negative consequences to your life, whether it's kind of physical negative consequences, so not getting enough sleep, not eating enough, whether it's mental, so constantly ruminating over the experience, if it's social, so losing social relationships, friendships, partnerships, or it's financial well-being. And so one sign that a behavior has become addictive is if it persists even though those negative consequences are occurring. So if you think of addiction to gambling, for instance, someone might continue to gamble even though they've damaged their marriage, they're losing money, they're not sleeping enough. And so one key thing here for respect to video games is that video game addiction doesn't necessarily mean playing lots of video games. What it means is negative consequences for one's life as a function of video game playing and an inability to stop doing it despite that. So lots and lots of people play lots of video games and don't suffer those negative consequences. We'll often label that passionate engagement versus pathology. Okay? And so if we think about the number of people who are actually, we might think of as addicted to video games, might be 1% to 2%, say, of children, keeping in mind that, say, 95% or more of children play video games of some sort. But just like in the case before, it doesn't really make sense to ask about video game addiction. Doesn't make sense anymore that would to ask about drug addiction, right? Are drugs addictive? Well, the word drug encompasses things like Tylenol and antibiotics, but also heroin and methamphetamine. And so, again, we need to think about the type of game. There are lots of different types of games, and some seem to be more associated with certain types of problem behaviors than others. So for instance, games that include certain types of role-playing components are more commonly associated with problem symptoms than those without those types of components. One thing that's hard for us as scientists is to know, well, is the game causing this, or is it the case that people who already have certain tendencies seek out that type of game? And that's work that's ongoing now. But it's certainly the case that different genres are associated, different types of games are more or less associated with problem types of behaviors. So what are the take-homes? Well, we know that video games can be really powerful tools for altering human behavior, and we see this throughout psychology, not just cognitive psychology, but educational psychology, social psychology. But we also know that different games will have different impact. So depending on the content, the dynamics, the mechanics in games, that will tell us what the impact is going to be on the brain and behavior. So what do we do? So as parents, the advice I tend to give is, one, pay attention. So what games are kids playing? What are they doing in those games specifically? How much are they actually playing? And sometimes this can be a challenge because video games are everywhere. So they can be on phones, they can be on tablets, computers at school. And then finally, are there any negative consequences that are kind of yoked to that playing? And if that's the case, it might be worth kind of thinking through some guidelines around playing. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening to my Badger Talk.